Carl Jung's final message about empaths will shatter everything you believe about compassion. The empath, Jung revealed, is just the child who was never allowed to have needs of their own. That desperate urge to fix everyone, to carry their pain, to erase yourself for others, that's not a spiritual gift. That's survival programming from a childhood where love was earned by staying quiet, staying small, staying useful. But here's what makes Jung's insight revolutionary. He didn't see perfectionists as high achievers. He saw them as people trapped in what he called psychological amber, frozen in childhood patterns that once meant survival, but now mean suffering. You already know this deep down. You've always sensed that your perfectionism came with a price you couldn't calculate. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But you've always felt that who you truly are was never good enough, that your authentic self had to be polished, perfected, and presented flawlessly to earn the right to exist. By the end of this journey, you will understand why your drive for perfection feels like both motivation and torture. You will recognize the psychological patterns that turned natural learning into performance anxiety, and most importantly, you'll discover Jung's path to what I call sacred imperfection, the healthy acceptance of mistakes that transforms perfectionism from prison into growth. This isn't about becoming sloppy or careless. It's about reclaiming the right to be human with the same compassion you'd show anyone else, learning something new. The origins of perfectionist programming. Jung understood something that most people miss about perfectionist development. What we call high standards in adults often begins as what I call mistake phobia in childhood, a survival mechanism that develops when a child's safety depends on never disappointing their caregivers. Think about this pattern: the child who learns to check their homework 5 times before showing their parent, the little one who becomes the family's good kid, always anticipating what's expected before being asked. The kid who learns that their mistakes create tension, but their achievements create temporary safety. Jung called this premature excellence, adaptation, when children develop sophisticated performance skills, not from healthy development, but from necessity. Your nervous system became a failure detection system, constantly scanning for potential mistakes before they could happen. This isn't conscious learning. This is adaptive wiring. Your brain literally rewired itself for survival in an environment where imperfection felt dangerous. You developed what Jung termed perfectionistic radar, an extraordinary ability to spot potential problems and flaws. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This survival adaptation came with a terrible cost: the suppression of what he called your authentic learning process, the healthy trial and error that every child needs to develop genuine confidence. Jung wrote, "The healthy individual is able to fail as gracefully as they succeed." But the future perfectionist learned the opposite lesson. Failure is dangerous because mistakes mean rejection. If you learn to hide your mistakes before you learn to learn from them, you understand this programming. The Perfectionist Paradox. This creates what I call the Perfectionist Paradox. The very standards that make you so reliable become the prison that prevents you from taking meaningful risks. You became an expert in avoiding failure while remaining terrified of success, because success might raise expectations even higher. Jung understood that this pattern, while protective in childhood, becomes self-destructive in adulthood. The child who wasn't allowed to fail grows into the adult who can't innovate, can't be vulnerable, or even identify what they actually want beyond avoiding disappointment. Jung made a startling discovery about what lies hidden in the unconscious of people with perfectionist patterns. In the shadow, the rejected parts of the psyche, he found not chaos, but what I call forbidden messiness, the natural experimentation that was deemed unacceptable in childhood. Most perfectionists carry tremendous guilt about their shadow because it contains everything they were taught was wrong: making mistakes, being unprepared, disappointing someone, looking foolish, not knowing the answer, being ordinary. Jung called this shadow formation through performance conditioning. But here's Jung's revolutionary insight. These imperfect impulses aren't pathological. They're the missing pieces of a complete learning process. The wounded achiever, the perfectionist who never learned healthy failure, becomes what Jung termed a wounded achiever, someone who succeeds from fear rather than joy. Jung observed that perfectionists often unconsciously resent their own achievements. They accomplish great things, but underneath there's exhaustion. There's a part of them that wants to stop performing, to make mistakes, to be ordinary for once. This isn't because they're lazy people. It's because Jung's compensation principle is at work. The psyche is trying to balance the one-sided development by pushing the rejected qualities into consciousness. Think about what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite when taken to extremes. The person who never makes mistakes eventually makes devastating ones. The one who always has the answer eventually stops asking questions. The perfectionist who refuses their shadow becomes paralyzed. Jung understood that integration of the shadow isn't about becoming careless. It's about reclaiming the right to exist as a learning human being. The perfectionist's shadow contains their sacred messiness, the healthy willingness to be imperfect that allows for genuine growth and authentic relationships. If you've ever felt guilty for wanting to quit something you're good at, you know this struggle. The Individuation Crisis. Jung identified a specific crisis that perfectionists face in their psychological development. He called it the performance rebellion. The moment when the psyche demands that you become who you actually are, not who you learn to be, to avoid disappointment. This crisis often manifests as what I call achievement burnout. Not just tiredness, but a deep soul exhaustion that comes from performing flawlessly for years. Jung understood this as the psyche's rebellion against continued self-imprisonment. The symptoms Jung documented are unmistakable. You can't fake motivation anymore. The old rewards don't work. Success feels hollow instead of satisfying. You start resenting the very thing that once defined you, your reliability and high standards. Jung saw this not as failure, but as psychological emergence. Your authentic self is trying to be born, but it requires dismantling the false self that was built around avoiding mistakes. This is where Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes crucial. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to bridge opposites. In this case, the achieving self and the experimenting self. It's not about choosing between excellence and mediocrity. It's about integrating both into what Jung called individuated competence. Jung observed that perfectionists in this crisis often feel like they're betraying everyone by changing. People say things like, "You're not as reliable as you used to be," or "You've gotten lazy." Jung understood this as the collective's resistance to individual development. But here's what Jung discovered about this process. The people who truly support you will celebrate your humanization. The ones who resist it were benefiting from your self-imprisonment. Sacred imperfection. Jung introduced a concept that most people misunderstand: sacred imperfection. This isn't sloppy work or careless execution. It's what Jung called the ethical obligation to be real. The recognition that your first responsibility is to your own authentic development, which requires making mistakes. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams? Who looks inside awakes?" For perfectionists, looking inside often reveals years of self-censorship disguised as excellence. What I call conscious imperfection involves several key elements that Jung identified as necessary for psychological health. First, mistake sovereignty, the recognition that your errors belong to you and are part of your learning process. Jung understood that avoiding all mistakes actually prevents psychological growth. Second, failure resilience, the ability to bounce back from setbacks without catastrophizing. Jung called this ego flexibility, and saw it as essential for both individual health and creative achievement. Third, process orientation, focusing on learning rather than just outcomes. Jung observed that perfectionists often treat their journey as optional, while treating their destination as mandatory. Jung discovered that perfectionists who develop sacred imperfection actually achieve more, not less. They create from curiosity rather than fear, from exploration rather than control, from authenticity rather than performance. This creates what Jung called differentiated excellence, the capacity to pursue quality without losing yourself in the process. You can strive for your best without demanding perfection. You can work hard without working from terror. You can achieve without disappearing. The integrated achiever Jung's vision of psychological wholeness includes what I call the integrated achiever, someone who has reclaimed their excellence as a conscious choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. This person represents Jung's ideal of individuation achieved. The integrated achiever possesses what Jung called conscious competence, the ability to pursue excellence without sacrificing their humanity in the process. They've learned to use their standards as tools rather than being enslaved by them. Jung identified several characteristics of psychological integration that apply specifically to perfectionists. First, creative courage, the capacity to risk failure in service of growth. Jung understood that healthy achievement requires an on-off switch controlled by conscious choice rather than automatic performance anxiety. Second, compassionate standards, the ability to maintain quality while accepting imperfection. Jung observed that the most effective people maintain what he called flexible excellence, high enough to inspire, realistic enough to achieve. Third, vulnerable leadership, the willingness to let others see your learning process. Jung noted that integrated achievers naturally model healthy striving, creating what he called mutual excellence. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The integrated achiever has achieved this by learning that their truest self includes both their capacity for excellence and their right to imperfection. This integration creates what Jung called earned confidence, a deep inner stability that doesn't depend on flawless performance. The integrated achiever can strive without suffering, achieve without anxiety, and excel without exhaustion. The freedom realization. Jung's most profound discovery about perfectionists centers on what I call the liberation insight, the moment when you understand that your perfectionism was never about excellence. It was about you trying to feel safe in a world that felt conditionally accepting. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The perfectionist's journey reveals that their hyper-responsibility for outcomes was actually an attempt to control their environment, to prevent the rejection they experienced or feared in childhood. This realization can be both liberating and terrifying. It means recognizing that much of what you called high standards was actually psychological armor, unconscious strategies to keep people pleased and yourself safe from criticism. But Jung discovered something liberating about this realization. Once you understand that your perfectionism was a survival strategy, you can choose to keep it or transform it. You're no longer controlled by unconscious programming. You become what Jung called the author of your own achievement story. This freedom creates what I call authentic excellence. Standards that come from love rather than fear, choice rather than compulsion, inspiration rather than desperation. The integrated achiever pursues quality because they want to, not because they have to. Jung observed that this transformation often triggers what he called performance guilt, the feeling that you are betraying your essential nature by accepting imperfection. The voice in your head that says, "But I've always been the reliable one," or "People depend on my high standards," or "What if I become mediocre?" But Jung understood this guilt as the final resistance of the false self that was built around avoiding mistakes. He called it identity mourning, grieving the version of yourself that was never real, but felt necessary. The truth about excellence. The truth Jung revealed is this: you were never meant to be a perfect performance machine. You were meant to be a conscious individual who chooses when and how to pursue excellence. Your standards were supposed to be a compass, not a cage. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For perfectionists, this includes accepting that they have the right to exist without constantly proving their worth through flawless execution. This acceptance creates what Jung called performance sovereignty, the recognition that you are the ultimate authority on your own standards. No one else can tell you what should be perfect, what should be good enough, or who you should impress." Jung observed that perfectionists who achieve this sovereignty often go through what he called the relearning phase, discovering how to approach tasks with curiosity rather than terror. They learn to speak to themselves with patience, to celebrate their efforts as much as their outcomes, and to find joy in the process of improvement. This internal relearning is crucial because Jung understood that you cannot sustain excellence from fear indefinitely. The perfectionist who learns to nurture their learning process becomes capable of authentic mastery. Jung also noted that performance sovereignty often involves grieving the unlived experiments, mourning all the risks, creative projects, and growth opportunities you avoided to maintain your perfect record. You might realize you chose careers, relationships, and life paths based on what you knew you could do flawlessly rather than what excited you to attempt. But Jung saw this grief as necessary in healing. It's the psyche's way of honoring what was lost while making space for what wants to emerge. The conscious creator. The perfectionist who achieves this sovereignty discovers something remarkable. Their capacity for genuine innovation actually increases. When you're no longer paralyzed by the need to be flawless, you have more energy for creative risk-taking. Jung observed that free perfectionists become conscious creators, people who innovate from wholeness rather than woundedness. They no longer need to achieve to feel valuable. They no longer need to be needed for their reliability. This creates what Jung called liberated excellence, quality that doesn't come with suffering attached, work that doesn't create anxiety, achievement that doesn't require perfectionism. Jung's final message about perfectionists is clear. Your journey is not about becoming careless. It's about becoming consciously excellent. It's about reclaiming your standards as tools you choose to use rather than chains you're compelled to wear. But Jung also warned about what he called the regression temptation, the urge to return to old patterns when faced with others' discomfort with your new humanity. He understood that growth requires staying committed to your authentic development even when others pressure you to return to your former flawless performance. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For perfectionists, this means recognizing that who you truly are includes both your capacity for excellence and your right to be imperfect, learning, and human. The final truth. The perfectionist is just the child who was never allowed to fail. But now you understand what Jung really meant. Your perfectionism isn't your strength. It's your incomplete development. You learn to use excellence as emotional armor instead of developing it as conscious craft. Jung showed us that the path forward isn't about becoming less excellent. It's about becoming consciously excellent. It's about reclaiming what he called your sacred imperfection, the healthy willingness to be human that allows for authentic achievement and genuine growth. You don't have to choose between high standards and self-compassion. Jung's individuation process shows you how to integrate both into psychological wholeness. The child who was never allowed to fail can grow into the adult who chooses when and how to pursue excellence. Your drive for quality is indeed a gift, but only when it comes from inspiration rather than terror, choice rather than compulsion, wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung spent his life proving that the most excellent people are those who have learned to be patient with their own learning process. The next time someone tells you that you've gotten too relaxed or that you're losing your edge, remember Jung's wisdom. You're not becoming less than you were. You're finally becoming enough as you are. And that transformation from unconscious perfectionism to conscious excellence is exactly what the world needs. Not more people who achieve until they break, but more people who know their worth and create from overflow. The perfectionist who was never allowed to fail is finally free to learn. And that choice to be human while pursuing excellence is the most revolutionary gift you can give to a world that desperately needs whole, conscious, integrated creators. Jung understood that the healed perfectionist becomes what he called a wounded healer of excellence, someone who can help others pursue their best work without destroying themselves in the process. They become mentors who model sustainable achievement, leaders who inspire rather than intimidate, and creators who show that mastery comes through practice, not perfection. But perhaps Jung's most profound insight about perfectionist recovery is this: the goal is not to eliminate your drive for quality, it's to transform it from a survival mechanism into a creative choice. You keep the passion for excellence while releasing the terror of imperfection. Jung called this final stage conscious mastery. The perfectionist who has integrated their shadow becomes someone who can produce exceptional work while remaining compassionate toward themselves and others. They can strive for their best while accepting that their best will vary depending on circumstances, energy, and life stage. This conscious master understands what Jung called the rhythm of excellence, that creativity has seasons of intense focus and seasons of restoration, periods of breakthrough achievement, and periods of quiet learning. They work with these rhythms instead of fighting them. The journey from unconscious perfectionism to conscious excellence is what Jung called one of the most difficult but necessary forms of individuation. It requires dismantling the identity that has kept you safe, facing the terror of being ordinary, and learning to love yourself as a work in progress. But Jung also believed it was one of the most important journeys a person could take, because the world doesn't need more people burning themselves out in pursuit of impossible standards. It needs more people who can do beautiful work from a place of joy, curiosity, and self-acceptance. If you've recognized yourself in this exploration of Jung's insights about perfectionism, know that your willingness to question your patterns is already the beginning of healing. The very fact that you're wondering whether there might be another way to achieve excellence, one that doesn't require sacrificing your humanity, is evidence that your authentic self is trying to emerge. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The perfectionist's version of this privilege is learning that who you truly are includes both your capacity for excellence and your right to be imperfect, learning, and beautifully, messily human. Your perfectionism isn't your enemy. It's your incomplete development-seeking wholeness. And Jung's path to integration shows you how to transform it from prison into pathway, from compulsion into conscious choice, from terror into creative courage.